I'm not pretending to be any great expert on inclusion, I have to say as well here, but I think the first thing I'd like to say is there is a difference here between individual development, the notion of education as growth, which is featured in philosophy over the years, including Dewey, and sort of more neoliberal modern conceptions of personalisation and choice, which are very much more about social efficiency, I think. So I think that distinction needs to be kept clear, that there is, I think, a major conflation goes on when we look at modern day curricula between what are ostensibly child-centred curriculum, which can trace their roots back to the work of Dewey on the one hand, and these sort of technical rational frameworks which are very much about social efficiency but dress themselves up in child-centred language. Jenny Reeves, a colleague who used to work with us at Stirling, who's now does some work at the University of Glasgow, has written a very good chapter on that in our book, Reinventing the Curriculum, if you want to know more about the genesis of these modern curriculum frameworks in terms of that. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The second point, I think, is that this is a question of balance. It's about getting the balances between, I suppose, on the one hand, what might be a culturally or individually sensitive curriculum that meets the needs of particular individuals, students, on the one hand, but also the need to educate people into the world in which they live. And I think Biester's work is quite helpful here, and he talks about getting the balance right between qualification, what you want people to know, basically, and be able to do. Subjectification, which is about the individuation, it's about how we develop as the unique individuals that we are in the world. And also socialisation, we have to educate people to fit into the world as it is as well. So getting that balance right is horrendously difficult, and in terms of curriculum design, I think we see an overemphasis on qualification and probably socialisation as well, and not enough on the individuation. So there's a few thoughts from me there.
I mean, even the fact that we're using the language of inclusive education and not special education, which is not uniform in different contexts, is, well, we are using the notion of inclusive education, but that doesn't mean that the practices of isolation of specific children or young people outside the mainstream school system has stopped occurring. This does not mean necessarily that they're in a different building. They could be in the classroom, and individualization often can become some kind of marginalization, of putting those kids aside for something different, rather than changing the context to enable them, according to what is going on, for example, autism and where they are on the spectrum, change the context to render what is going on in the classroom accessible for everyone. So there's universal curriculum design, or there's differentiation, and there's different literatures which are actually trying to talk about the same thing, that curriculum as, again, it goes back to that top-down, the uniform thing imposed on teachers, rather than curriculum as an open-ended framework, which can then be it's malleable to consider all kinds of diversity in the classroom and in schools. And I've learned a little bit more about this because I co-designed a course of curriculum development for inclusive education with a colleague who's a specialist in inclusive education. I didn't know this a few years ago. So that's another example, I mean, of how we, by collaborating and networking, and we keep learning. But there are curricular documents or frameworks which can be really helpful to that end, or can be really constricting in helping teachers think that, it's changing the context to render knowledge accessible to everybody, and not sort of providing a poor curriculum to specific children. Two very different conceptions of schooling and education as a social public good, or as a children's right in another language.
I mean, you can find this, I mean, the compensatory idea of something bringing or changing the context. I mean, we find that in my country. I'm not an specialist in inclusive education, but of course, we talk about inclusion on the one hand and then diversity, and we have a different kind of moral issues, because you could say philosophically that if you include everyone, someone will perhaps be excluded, because you will have children with different needs. Perhaps they are very, well, perhaps aggressive in a way, and some students, they can't manage that. You get my point, we have these different. So you could talk about they are mutually dependent, these, I mean, diversity, inclusion, and I would also suggest a third concept like equity, talking about, well, how can we provide well, equal education in that sense, a curriculum that is free from. But I mean, this also, if you look historically, you can see it follows different tracks of, I mean, it comes back, it's like a pendulum that swings. And we have this individualization idea, very much the neoliberal. Everyone should be in the classroom. Of course, that it's challenging for teachers to do that. I mean, but it's one way. I'm not sure where I was going with this, but I might find out. But the idea is that
it's been a long day.
It's been a long day, but I think it's important to have that. I mean, it's conflicting values and it happens in the practice, but it's a curriculum that has to be open for the wider, so we don't put, because it also puts a tag on the students. Maybe that's what I was about to say. Save me, help me. Anyway.
Okay, does that address your question?